So the second limbic structure that we need to get to know is the hippocampus. And you can see it here in blue. It's a thin, curving structure that winds its way around the entire amygdala. And the word hippocampus is actually the Greek word for seahorse. And you can see how it kind of looks like a seahorse. And the hippocampus is one of the few places in the brain where new neurons are born. Here's a cute little drawing from an illustrator called Lady, who draws a bunch of cute brain drawings. You can check out her Instagram, I'll link to it. So she's drawn the hippocampus as a seahorse, remembering something. So hopefully that helps you remember how to find the hippocampus in an image. So when I was in college taking brain and behavior, just think 1999, we haven't even discovered denim on denim. It's a very sad world. I was told that we were born with all the neurons we were ever going to have, and that they only die. It's kind of sad, but it also kind of made sense. Babies are full of promise and kind of full of potential to make connections, and pruning those extra connections is part of how we become more focused as we grow into being adults. That's all true, but in the past 10 to 15 years, neuroscientists have found pretty compelling evidence that new neurons are actually born in the adult human hippocampus throughout the lifetime. And it may be that this process of neurogenesis, which is simply new neurons being born, is crucial to memory and to maintaining our emotion. So there's some evidence that when new neurons aren't born at an appropriate rate, a person can become depressed. This is all pretty unknown. And then just in April, a new study came out that used really excellent methods, and they found no neurogenesis in the adult brain. So it's still in question. By the time you guys graduate, maybe this will be settled. But right now, the evidence stacks up in favor of believing that the hippocampus is where new neurons can be born. And this makes sense because the hippocampus is intimately involved in the processing of memory. So I have to pause us here and make sure that we don't fall into a rookie mistake. It's really common for a graduate of this class to accidentally walk away with the impression that the hippocampus is where memories are stored. Because I've been telling you the hippocampus is responsible for processing new memories. Well, that doesn't mean that it's where the memories are located. The hippocampus is like a loading dock, where all the experiences and information and thoughts that you've been through in a day are processed. So if you've ever been down to the docks in Long Beach, these huge boats come in with like big shipping containers that'll eventually get loaded onto 18-wheelers. This is also season something of The Wire, the one where it's a bunch of people at the docks. They're taking all this stuff off of the boats, stacking it in different ways. Trucks are coming in, picking up the materials, and moving it off to where it goes. So the hippocampus is like that loading dock. It's a place where memory gets actively processed to go and be stored wherever it's going to go and be stored. Okay, so this leads us to a good question. Where is long-term memory stored? And this is a scene from the iconic psychology movie Inside Out, which I loved because it gets so many things right about thought, emotion, and even, by analogy, about the brain. But it does depict a pretty big misconception when it comes to memory. In the movie, memories are depicted as these little colorful marbles that are all sort of stored on the shelf like books in a library. And this is often how we think that our memory works. You're like, okay, first day of freshman year of high school. You find it on the stacks like a librarian using the Dewey Decimal System, and you pull it off. Here's my memory. It doesn't work like that. Long-term memories are actually stored throughout the cortex. Memories are not stored in one precise information in the brain. So retrieving a long-term memory is not much like a librarian pulling a book off the shelf. It's a lot more like a chef heading to the kitchen to whip up a sandwich. So in other words, the hippocampus is involved and the frontal cortex is involved in pulling all different elements of the memory from the various locations where they're stored and remixing or whipping up a fresh instance of that memory for you to experience right now while you're reflecting. So I'll give you an example to sort of help this make sense. When I think back to the day I first met my husband, let's see, it was 6th grade, so side ponytail, bike shorts. I mean, it was a scene. I had like the waterfall bangs that curved over, Aquanet, the whole thing. And I went to pick up with my mom, a friend of mine, and she said, "See those guys smoking over there by the dumpster? The long-haired one's my brother." Okay, so when I think back to that memory, what's actually happening is that my memory of the visual scene, his gorgeous glam rock Axl Rose hair, is actually stored in my visual cortex where it was originally processed. So my brain goes and gets the visual element. My memory of kinesthetic awareness, where I was standing, how hot it was, 80s Texas sidewalk that day, that's stored in my somatosensory cortex. My brain gets that piece of the memory, brings it together. My sense of emotions, which frankly were meh, I didn't care. But my sense of the emotion of that moment is stored somewhere in the limbic area. It's retrieved then. And my sense of the sound of a garbage truck driving nearby to eventually disturb the smoking boys and get trash out of the dumpster is stored where auditory memories are processed. So your brain is running around, picking up all these pieces and putting them back together. Now, a really interesting implication is that your mood at the moment of memory retrieval can actually color the way that you remember a scene from the past. So when you're in a negative mood and you remember something, a tense moment, something a little embarrassing, you'll paint it much worse. When you're in an upbeat mood and you remember the same incident, you might kind of gloss over the negative elements and focus on the positive. Our memories aren't the VCR that we like to think they are. I'm sorry, have you guys seen a VCR? Just kidding. Okay, so yeah, our memories aren't a digital file, an uncorruptible file. They're actually colored by our recall in significant ways. And therapists actually use this when they're working with victims of trauma, folks with PTSD. If they can help the patient to remember the traumatic moment without getting physiologically aroused in response to the memory, it can fade some of the dramatic emotion that's attached to that memory. In other words, the brain goes into the kitchen, whips up that sandwich, that horrible moment when your chopper went down or you had an emergency C-section, what have you. And if you can calmly recall it, a little of that spirit of calm is filed back with those ingredients when they go back to their locations in the cortex. So memory is malleable depending on how we think about it as we recall it. That's one of the more mind-blowing things I have to tell you in this class. So memories are rebuilt from their component elements every time they're recalled, but it's the hippocampus' job to do that work and to process memories initially. One of the very first studies of the hippocampus was a really cool study. They only knew that it was involved in memory. They weren't sure very many of the details, but they had the hypothesis that people with incredible memories might show some physical difference in the hippocampus. Maybe it would be meatier, juicier, more connections. So they found a bunch of guys, at this time it was all guys, in London who were about to take the London cabbie test. So I don't know if you've been to London, but they have these famous black and white checkered cabs that still get used even in the age of Uber and Lyft, because cab drivers have to go through an exam that's really exhaustive, and they have to have the entire map of London memorized. And it's a garbage map. This is like a Roman city that got built on by medieval people. It's just crazy. So it takes a lot of study. People often study for years and take the test multiple times. So they tested hippocampal volume in a bunch of people who were about to begin studying for the London cabbie exam. And then they retested them after they successfully passed it. And they found that particularly in their right hippocampus, which is in charge of processing those spatial memories, they found that area enlarged. So the hippocampus itself can sort of build like a muscle as we become better and better at laying down particular types of memory. So that doesn't mean that the mental map of London was in the hippocampus, but the hippocampus got strong and developed from all of the spatial memory processing that these students did over the course of the time that they were prepping for the London Cabby exam. All right, so if you remember nothing else about memory, remember that it's like making a sandwich and the brain's rebuilding it each time a memory is recalled.